Now, what was the Pure Food and Drug Act was just about truth in labeling, which is really interesting because it didn't have anything to do with safety. It didn't have anything to do with the idea of whether the drugs that were being marketed were effective or not. And it didn't stop any of the drugs like heroin that were already on the market. All it said was that if you put heroin, morphine, cocaine, cannabis into your product and market it for whatever you claimed it cured, you had to list that on the label. So you couldn't be deceptive about having something on the label and not have it there. So what was the law used for? You think I'm going to tell you that it was used to stop some great outrage of drugs. You know, there had been, as a matter of fact, a drug that had killed 107 people, most of them children, because it included a sort of an antifreeze product that was used in brake batteries. And you would think it would be used against something like that. No. The first major case that Harvey Washington Wiley brought under the Food and Drug Act was against Coca-Cola. Why? Because he said, and the government said, it's not truth in labeling. You, Coca-Cola, you're called Coca, but you don't have anything from the coca plant in your product. They'd taken that out decades earlier. And you have caffeine in Coca-Cola. You don't list that on the label. So it's misbranding, it's incorrect marketing. They brought the suit, they lost it. So it wasn't successful. What changes the American drug industry is not that law, but two other laws. The Harrison Act, passed in 1914, suddenly makes all narcotics illegal overnight. So the government decides, by the way, we have growing problems with addiction and abuse and diversion. We've got to stop it. Harrison Act stops all narcotics. So right away, these drugs, which have been dependent themselves on things like morphine, heroin, opium, laudidum, all of these different items, cocaine and cannabis, they can't use it anymore. Then a couple of years later, they go into that great experiment that failed on prohibition, in which alcohol is banned, and they've lost the basis for most of their drugs. So you literally have an industry that started with addictive drugs in an anything goes environment, and then all of a sudden it had to go cold turkey. You know, you talk about addicts having to go cold turkey. The drug industry did. It was looking for its next product. And to show you how what we think today is this mammoth trillion-dollar industry that's become so powerful was really lost is the fact that it didn't have any products to put out for the most part. It was looking for products. And when Moody's is this American institution that ranks companies by size. It comes in, it started in 1909, and it tells you the size of industries. It tells you which ones are the largest: steel industry, auto industry, telecommunications, technology, pharma. When Moody's started ranking American industries in 1909, the pharmaceutical industry was so small, it wasn't even listed as a separate category. It was a subset of the American chemical industry. It wasn't even listed as a separate category until nearly 1930, which goes to show you how the industry that we think of as so large today wasn't even on the radar in terms of really being a real business. There was insulin discovered in 1922 in Canada, a major breakthrough in terms of people who had uncontrolled sugar problems. And Eli Lilly locked up the distribution rights for that. But that was the big drug discovery. Otherwise, there was nothing that was new. There was even very little understanding about what caused illness, what caused diseases. In 1938, for the first time, this Humphreys Act, that Congress passes a regulation that says, by the way, for prescriptions that come forward, when we do have them in the future, and for drugs that exist now, you're going to need prescriptions. For the first time, the American Medical Association and doctors have inserted themselves into the process so that instead of the anything goes attitude of the past, in the future, when drugs are approved for this fledgling new Food and Drug Administration, although we're not quite sure what they will be yet, when they are approved, drug companies won't be able to sell directly to you, the consumer. There'll be this circuitous route. They'll have to go through doctors who will have to write prescriptions, and they will be the ones who judge whether the prescription's right or not. And then what revolutionizes the business? What we know as the modern pharmaceutical industry really came about in World War II with the advent of penicillin. Now, there's no doubt penicillin, who these English researchers at Oxford were working on, had been an accidental discovery by the Scottish sort of pharmacologist in 1928 in his laboratory, and then sat on the side. Nobody really knew what to do with penicillin. These group of Oxford researchers picked it up and thought it was important in the late 1930s. It is one of the most important discoveries ever, because not only does it end up saving hundreds of thousands of lives in World War II on the battlefield from infections, but it saves ordinary lives. People who, cut themselves while pruning a rose bush, something as simple as that, and would later get an infection and would lead to blood poisoning and they could die from it. Infections of all different types that caused deaths beforehand. Really, it was one of the wonder drugs. But nobody realized it until these Oxford researchers came over to the US and said, by the way, we have this drug that we think will be important. And the US government said, oh, okay, middle of World War II, why don't we do a crash effort on this? And, you might think about COVID when you think about what's happened with vaccines, and we'll talk about that later. But in World War II, when it came to penicillin, US government made it the secret second project in terms of government funding during the war. The number one secret project was the Manhattan Project for the atomic weapon. The second secret project was the Penicillin Project. And the government took 15 pharmaceutical firms that volunteered for this. They paid them and put tens of millions of dollars of government effort into it. They built the large manufacturing plants that were necessary to produce in fermentation plants the penicillin that would be produced. And they literally transformed the drug industry so that by the end of the war, these companies were producing massive amounts of penicillin. Very important point to note, as opposed to COVID, where the government has given billions of dollars, and so have European governments, billions of dollars to drug companies without any ownership over those rights. They've allowed the drug companies to own the rights of what they develop. With penicillin, the government said, we're going to develop this. We're going to give you the money. We're going to build the plants. You're going to make the drug, but nobody owns the rights to penicillin. It's a general drug. There's no patent on it. Everybody can sell it. And as a result, the price of penicillin dropped to pennies a dose after the war. There was tremendous competition for it. What happened, though, is very interesting. What transformed the business are a couple of things. First, at the start of the war in 1939, 1940, if you take a snapshot of the drug industry worldwide, German pharmaceutical companies were the early ones, Bayer, the others, Hecht and others. They were at the forefront, IG Farben. 1 out of every 2 prescriptions written in the world at the start of World War II came from a German pharmaceutical company. Remarkable, half of all the world's drugs. At the end of World War II in 1946, and that continued from that point on, the American pharmaceutical companies, the 15 that emerged from the Penicillin Project, controlled 80% of the world's prescriptions and 90% of the world's profits. The German companies had been decimated in the bombings at the end of World War II, so they were temporarily outside of the business. The American government had seized many of the German companies here inside the US. The same had happened in Europe. So the German pharmaceutical company was pushed far in the background. The American companies who were made strong on penicillin came to the forefront. And what happened in the 50s becomes what I call the template for American drug companies going forward for what we know them for the last 70 years.